So this is actually our 34th webinar, monthly webinar. It's almost 3 years now. And this is actually one that I've been kind of wanting to do for quite a while. It's about box one, expectations and feedback, but particularly about expectations. And so, as it says in the slide, my experience has been for decades, and I suspect yours is too if you reflect on it, that just about every performance problem I've ever encountered, every opportunity to improve performance, can benefit from clarifying and aligning expectations. So we're going to sort of get into it. And before we do, I want to just tell you we've got some more webinars coming up. And hello, Tony. Hello, Aaron. We're going to talk about implementation and change management for sustainment at some point. And we're also going to talk about what we refer to as what good looks like. We're an accomplishment-based approach to performance, but you got to know what a good accomplishment is, and that has a lot of implications. It's actually part of setting expectations, our topic for today. And then we'll also be talking a little bit about sales knowledge fluency. And those are upcoming webinars. Next month, I'm pretty excited. Again, this is one I've been planning for a long time. One of the great giants of performance improvement, who was pretty much the main protege of Tom Gilbert, Joe Harless, after he retired, wanted to get back to what he and Tom used to talk about as the educational revolution. And Joe wrote a book called The Eden Conspiracy, which was in the direction of accomplishment-based education. And he published this, or he was working on it actually, and local folks in Newnan, Georgia, which is where he lived, were having challenges with the schools not producing graduates who could work in their businesses. And so they approached Joe, and he put together a task force over an extended period of time, which pulled together a program which actually put what is described in the book into practice. So I'm going to talk a little bit next month about this book. I had the good pleasure of when it was out, the first edition was out of print. I had the benefit that I worked with Carol Harless, Joe's widow, to get a second edition of this book published by the Cambridge Center for Behavioral Studies. And I had the good fortune to be able to write the prologue and epilogue to it about what had happened in the 20 years since. So I think this is going to be a real good one, not just for educators, but for pretty much anybody thinking about our educational system. As I think you know, our webinars and other videos get posted on YouTube, and we've got 33 webinars posted there with also some presentations, some short video playlists, and so forth, trying to provide as much information as we can to people about what we've learned over the years. And also something that some of you know about, I'm sure, is that we've started creating some free study guides for these webinars. They're just very simple one-pagers, but a surprising number of our colleagues have started reading groups or incorporated this into their reading groups, where instead of reading, they watch the video and then talk about it. So if you're interested in subscribing to the free webinar study guides, we've done 7 of them so far. We're going to do more going forward. You can just aim your phone at that QR code and fill out the form. And also, of course, this will be recorded and put on YouTube. So if you are watching the recording, please subscribe. Please share it with your colleagues. Please like it. That always helps us. Now, the agenda for today is pretty simple. I want to talk about, even though virtually everybody I see in the group here probably know about this work in the performance thinking framework, I'm going to do a quickie overview of the elements of performance thinking to set the stage for how we talk about and think about expectations. And then I want to spend most of the time on sort of what can go wrong and what all the different issues are around how expectations get set, communicated, aligned, and so forth, and how we can perhaps improve that. And then have some takeaways. And I'm hoping we'll have some discussion, because we got a really good group of people here, I can see already. Now, one of the things I should mention is there's a lot more to be said than an hour's worth or a day's worth almost of conversation about expectations. And so you probably all know a lot. And what I'm going to be giving you is some of it is kind of rapid fire, some of it examples, quite a mix. But my hope is that in the process, it will a little bit expand people's notion of how to think about setting expectations at any level that you're working, even including personal relationships. So let's start with this. What influences our behavior? Because expectations are a big influence. And I go back to my teacher, B.F. Skinner, who had this framework. He talked about discriminative stimuli, also later called by others antecedents, set the occasion for behavior or responding, that hopefully is followed by consequences, hopefully positive consequences, positive reinforcing stimuli, as the little symbol says there. And so this is where it starts, because antecedents and consequences, as defined by Skinner, are events that affect behavior. Now, Tom Gilbert, who actually spent some time with Skinner in the Office of Program Instruction, and who was quite a brilliant thought leader himself, recognized that in what he called the world of work, it's a little bit more complicated than the so-called three-term contingency. What he recognized was that Skinner's research and his model pretty much came out of the laboratory, where whether it was white cardinal pigeons or hooded rats or monkeys or others, or even humans in a very restricted laboratory environment, where it was fairly straightforward to talk about antecedents, behavior, and consequences, and that's what could be changed or modified or manipulated to improve or change behavior. But what Tom recognized was in the world of work amongst us humans, it's not that simple. And so he took the three-term contingency, turned it into two columns in a 3x2 model that he called the behavior engineering model, recognizing that in the environment gives you information in the form of what he called data that are antecedents, essentially, and also feedback, it turns out, and that the environment also gives you instruments. It's not just a key or a lever like you'd find in the laboratory. It could be anything. It could be the right tools, software, reference materials. It could also be, if you extend the idea, other people who are helpful. It could be the design of your environment. There's many, many things that enable people to perform as they perform when they do so. And then he talked about consequences and incentives. But what he recognized was that the individual brings an existing repertoire to the table or needs to develop that repertoire. And he called that knowledge. Sort of information that you carry around with you is one way he thought about it. And then capacity, which refers to individual capacity, that is, what is the individual, what does the person have that enables them to respond, to basically do the task or the job that you're asking them to do. And then motives was Gilbert's way of talking about what Skinner called functional definition of consequences. That is, you can present an incentive, but if the performer doesn't care about it, it's not going to work. So you got to take their motives into account. So this was Tom's model. And as many of you know, I started working with it in the very early 80s when I was doing sales enablement projects. And we were focused on the knowledge component. But what we recognized with was that these other categories, the other cells in the model, gave us a really powerful framework for thinking about what are all the other things we have to put in place besides sort of training or skills and knowledge. And so I and the people on the teams that I was leading in consulting projects got very excited about this. But we were a little bit nerdy. And what we learned was, as we tried to partner with our clients, and this was during the mid-'80s, basically, and we wanted to share the behavior engineering model with them, people kind of looked like this. They sort of were confused. And, well, what do you mean by instruments? What is that? Or data? What kind of data? Or incentives? Well, what about consequences that we didn't know about in advance, like unintended consequences, and so on? So what we found is we tried to teach people that model. People made a lot of mistakes. They made category errors. And so I spent with my colleagues probably 3 to 5 years tweaking the language in the cells, trying to use plain English language so that it would be moderately self-explanatory. And we user tested this. We would try different words and we would teach people this and we'd see if they could make if they made category errors and so forth. And so we came up with this toward the end of the 80s. And then one of our clients, Tom Hogan, named it in about 92, the 6 boxes model. And so we've run with this. And what we found is that people find it to be a very useful and very easy to communicate and collaborate with a framework for what influences behavior. Now, we added to that what we call the performance chain that came straight out of Gilbert and Harless, that says the elements of performance are behavior that produce accomplishments or work outputs, things of value, which are valuable because they contribute to organizational or business results. And so these were our units of analysis. And as you can see, behavior influences are at the front end of that. And that's where the 6 boxes model belongs. And so we also then put those two models together, the 6 boxes model and of behavior influence and the 3 elements of performance in the performance chain to form what we call the model for performance improvement logic. And so we follow a sequence here, whether we're doing informal coaching or big projects or anything in between. We want to know what's at stake for the organization or for the society or whatever the entity is that we're trying to improve, empower, affect. So we want to know what the business results are. Why are we doing this again? Is this market share or customer satisfaction or employee engagement? What is this about? And then we look at the accomplishments or work outputs, the products of behavior that are involved, whether it's a process or the job of an individual or role and so forth. And we want to be sure that those things actually do contribute to business results. Once we know that, then we're in a very strong position. We identify the needed behavior. We can do task analyses, we can do exemplary performer analysis, but we come up with the behavior. And that helps us, first of all, define what we can measure, because we can measure behavior, we can measure or count good work outputs, and we can measure business results. But it also gives us now a foundation for analyzing and brainstorming and choosing behavior influences to influence the behavior, to produce the outputs, to contribute to business results. And so we implement it, we select some measures, and we adjust as we go to improve it. So this is the real quick and dirty version of the framework that what I'm about to say comes out of. Now, one of the things that's perhaps obvious, but we share these models because what we found was that the plain English really allows us to do it. And you don't have to be a nerd, you don't have to be a performance improvement professional. You don't usually have a problem knowing what expectations and feedback are or understanding what behavior influences might be. It's pretty easy to define the different things defined by those 21 plain English words in the 2 models and work with people. And as many of you know, our clients in the early 2000s named this performance thinking. They basically said, you're helping us think differently about performance, and this is very helpful. So that's kind of the framework. Now, what we've learned, though, and this is getting down to the topic at hand, is, among other things, expectations really matter. And whether we're talking about senior executives or frontline workers or anybody in between, coaching, training, doing performance improvement, having relationships with their colleagues or friends or significant others, expectations matter. And so that's what we want to get into a little bit. Now, I always like to share, I'm going to share a few stories from my own history, but this is one of the ones that I sort of tend to talk about a lot. I was working with a large sort of global scale enterprise software company back in the 90s and early 2000s. And I was working with a sales organization, and this is a company that had a whole lot of different products, big products for big companies. And there was one new product offering that they developed, a whole new system. And I attended their sales meeting, and it had a whole lot of people at it. It had, I don't remember how many, but at least 1,000, I think, or 800. And so I was in the back of the room, and I was sitting next to a couple of sales representatives. And the product manager or VP was up front talking about how important this product is. And I really want you guys to go out and sell it, because if we can get into the organization with this product, it's going to pay off and we'll have more opportunity to drive other products, blah, 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 blah. He was really pushing it. He was trying to set the expectation that this ought to be top on your list. But I was standing next to these senior salespeople who had just gotten their compensation plan that morning. They were looking down on it and they were saying, well, there's really no extra bonus for selling this new product, and I don't know it very well, and I can definitely make my numbers with the stuff we've been selling all along, so why bother? And so this was a great example of essentially conflicting expectations, one of them stated by the product manager, and the other one implicit based on what they were rewarding people for, which was nothing different for selling this product versus the products they already knew. So that's a classic example of where you blunt the effect of the intervention by having conflicting expectations. Now, when you drill into the 6 boxes model, one of the things you see is it's a complete system. So this is one of the job aids we use. This is the positive behavior influences, and it was our attempt. I think I originally did this in 1990 something, but this was our attempt to get in on one page with as few bullets as possible, pretty much cover the board of the things you could do positively in the different cells. And what you start to recognize is that these things all work together. So the example I just gave you really was an example of how expectations, box 1, ought to line up with box 3, consequences, and it didn't. And so that affects how the expectations work. And that is the case everywhere. If you ask me to do something, then you better recognize when I do the right thing, or at some point I'm probably not going to be doing it anymore. But it is a system. These things are all work together. Now here is our sort of formal definition of box 1, expectations and feedback. And it's essentially information about what to do and produce and how to do it. And then feedback is how you're performing against those expectations. And you can read the details there, but that's essentially what we're talking about with box 1. And in box 1, we can look at the enablers. And again, this is a short list, but expectations aligned with consequences is very important. Descriptions and measures of expected work outputs, the things you're supposed to produce. Clear and relevant information, expectations for how to do the job, the behavior. Models or examples of expected work outputs of behavior are really helpful in setting expectations for things. Ongoing measurement, which is not only used to set goals, which are expectations, but also provide feedback. And then feedback and constructive suggestions for improvement. And this could be expanded upon a great deal, but those are sort of the positive things that we want to be sure in place. And then we can look at the obstructions. What can go wrong? So when things are not aligned, expectations and consequences are not aligned, or when descriptions and measures of expected work outputs are not there, or contradictory, or fuzzy. And the same with how to do the job, behavior. Well, you should just do it, Sometimes you don't have to tell people step by step how to do something, but very often, especially with new performers, you do need to be explicit about it. No models, etc. So you can read that yourself. But the point is we can look at what works and what doesn't in each of the cells of the model. Now, one of the nice things about being accomplishment-based, where we focus on what we call work outputs or accomplishments, is that we also, and many of you have been through our programs, and you know that we teach, once you define a work output, like a decision or a relationship or a document or a widget or whatever, we also want to know what good looks like. What are the criteria that define a good one of these? Because when we do that, it makes it a heck of a lot easier for the performer, as well as any manager, supervisor, or coach they might have, to say, that's a good one. Notice it's meeting those criteria or not. So having criteria for good is a really important part of expectation setting, and it's a really powerful one in our accomplishment-based approach. Also, an important part of setting expectations for people, if nothing else, getting people's attention, is to be able to talk to people about why they're producing this work output. Why does it matter? Why is this stupid little form you're asking me to fill out every day for many, many times on the screen? Who cares? Well, if that form was accurate, timely, and complete, it may contribute to regulatory compliance. We could get nailed if you don't fill it out right. Or it may contribute to customer service because it'll be the information that the customer service reps needs later, et cetera. So you're explaining to people how what they do and produce contributes. And people like that. And so again, there is a connection really between the expectation we set and really the result, the impact it has on the organization, society, or wherever. And that's part of a good manager's or leader's or organization's setting of expectations. What it is we expect and why. Now, we can talk about all the things in box 1, but for example, if I don't know what I'm supposed to do, how could other stuff help me? You can give me all the software or rewards in the world, but if I don't actually know what I'm supposed to do, it's not going to help much. Or if I don't know what I'm supposed to produce, so the output, then how will I even know when I'm successful, when I'm done? Is this good enough or not? If I don't have some clarification about what a good one is of an output or an accomplishment, I'm a little bit in the dark. And if I don't know how my job contributes to the organization, how will I even know, what's valuable? What do I contribute of value? And of course, if my team members, if I'm working with a group of people in a process or a team, if we aren't on the same page, if we don't all have clear, understood expectations, then good luck on that one. How are we going to get anything done cost effectively? And in particular, how are we going to enjoy doing it? How are we going to feel good as a team getting it done? And of course, if you really push that, if we can't come to an agreement about what we're supposed to do next, how are we going to avoid confusion and waste of time and resources and even conflict? So it starts with box one. And I always like this one because it affects our personal relationships too. How often with your significant other or your spouse or your friend have you thought you had it all clear about what you were going to do and when or what time you were going to do something, or if you're going to go to the wedding or the football game on Saturday, and all of a sudden you say, oh, I didn't know that, Well, that causes trouble. In some cases, it causes big trouble. But even at a minimum, for example, with an employee and a supervisor or manager, if the expectations aren't shared, then you can really go off the rails. Is another one that I think is an interesting way to think about it in relationship to trust. Now, Stephen M.R. Covey, who is the second of three Coveys who published books, had a book called The Speed of Trust, I believe. And I think this is a really cool statement from him. He says, most relationship breakdowns of trust are the result of violated expectations. People who can consistently clarify expectations have more influence and produce better results with the same resources. They're more likely to get promoted, receive the best projects, attract greater talent, and have the biggest budgets. Now, this is a guy who's looked at a lot of big organizations for a long time, so he definitely knows what he's talking about. And I think we can all relate to this. I don't think any of this is a mystery, but it's worth reminding ourselves. Now, if we get down to it, so much of this has to do with leaders and managers because, for example, as the Gallup 12 employee survey results show about employee engagement, ultimately you really work for your manager. You may work for the company and the company creates an environment in which you work, and that's true. However, your immediate supervisor or manager sets expectations, gives you access to the tools, recognizes it when you do well, etc. So what we've always said is that, especially for new managers, if you're a new manager or supervisor, your job is not primarily to be the smartest person in the team. Your job is to arrange behavior influences so people will be productive and engaged. Happy campers being productive. So that's important. It goes back to leaders and managers. Now, here's another example from my own history, working in a call center years ago. And I don't know if any of you have ever worked in a customer call center, but a typical situation is you're sitting in front of a screen and you've got a whole bunch of different software applications going on. And you've got to know a lot and you've got to be able to speak in appropriate ways to the customer, especially if they're yelling at you or upset. And you might have to do it while they're yelling at you and upset. It's a complicated job. And I remember asking, there was one particular setting where we asked the representatives, the customer service representatives, like, how do you know for this particular kind of information you have to get, where to get it? And the answer was, it depends what shift we're on. Because different supervisors tell us, one says you should do it through the account system and the other one tells you another thing. Now, that might be okay up to a point, but what our recommendation was, why don't you guys just decide on one way to do the thing and communicate that to everybody consistently? Because otherwise you get people caught like, no, you do it this way, no, you do it that way. So that's a classic thing where multiple supervisors or multiple managers deliver slightly different stories. Now, we developed this list quite a few years ago 2016, 2017, when we recognized, and some of you probably know about the Gallup 12 Employee Engagement Survey, it's these 12 sort of statements that people rate. And Gallup's been using this for about 30 years to assess the extent to which companies have engaged employees. And it's very predictive. The top quartile of companies that in scores on this survey have measurably are more profitable, have greater market share, have higher customer satisfaction, et cetera. And so what we did is we took the 6 boxes and we took the Gallup 12 and we sort of fleshed it out based on what we knew what managers and leaders do. So if you look in here, what you see is these are practices or behavior from a manager or a leader which establish or put in place the behavior influences for each of the cells. And so we teach these best practices to leaders and managers in various contexts. Now, if you zero in on box 1, one of the cool things about box 1 is basically everybody can participate in it. That is, as leaders, managers, supervisors, people setting expectations, we want to be as clear as we can be. As I'll also mention a little bit later, we also want to be sure people, if they're unclear, we want to say, please, if you're not clear about this, please ask me. Let's see if we can get clear about this. And again, if you're the manager or supervisor, you ought to check for understanding. You ought to see if the person can demonstrate what it was that you asked them to do or told them to do, or can describe it back to you at least. So you're pretty sure that the thing was communicated. Now, those practices articulate a vision from the highest level of what we're trying to get to here. Link that vision to strategy and daily activity and work. Set clear goals and define expectations. Align expectations up and down the organization or the team. Share metrics that people can use for feedback and also for setting goals, etc. Those are all practices that good leaders and managers engage in, whether they think about it that way or not. And they're all basically box 1 things. And as I said before, I have yet to encounter a performance problem or opportunity where we don't have opportunities to clarify expectations. Another one, I don't have a slide for this, but I did a big process project some years ago at a biotech firm, and it was a very high visibility and highly sort of controversial process. It was the process that some of you may be familiar with in highly regulated companies, where anything that goes out to marketing or to advertising to the public, or anything that gets used in sales training, needs to go through a group. In this case, it included clinical experts, science people, attorneys, and people who knew about the constraints of regulatory compliance. And so, as many of the marketing people would say, we bring them a brochure and they give us back a PhD dissertation. There was a lot of challenges about, you can't use these words and you have to be careful about this because, we got dinged on this last year and it cost us a whole lot of money, et cetera. Well, when we looked at this carefully and when I interviewed a whole bunch of people, we found that there were a bunch of different teams the key teams that reviewed material, and especially the attorneys, but other members of these teams had different expectations. Some of them had gone through big problems where the company lost millions of dollars due to some fine because they'd communicated something inaccurate to the public. And other ones had not had that kind of traumatic experience. And so some of them were like, you can't use these words. And other people would say, no, that's okay. It's not going to be a problem. And so there were differences in expectations, which you can imagine in such a high stakes environment produced an awful lot of conflict. And so among our 18 recommendations was that you get consistent on the set of expectations about what's okay and what's not. Now, one of the ways to think about it, if you're a manager or a leader, if you're defining a process, if you're defining performance for anybody, is to actually clarify the elements of performance. So our performance chain model is a very convenient way to do that, because what it means is it gives you the 3 things: what you're supposed to do, the behavior, what the product of that behavior is, the work outputs, the accomplishments, and why, what the organizational results to which this contribute. So just getting clear on that with your people is a big deal. That's the first step in really defining expectations. And, we use a tool called the individual performance map when we're working with individuals. And I see some of the folks in this that are with us today who've actually either delivered our coaching program or been in our practitioner program, or both. And what is that when we're analyzing the performance of a role, we use this map to define the contributions or work outputs or accomplishments of a job. In this case, it's an instructional design manager. And if we're coaches, we use this as the first conversation we have with the person we're coaching to actually go through the process of listing all these things so that the coach and the coachee are very clear on aligned expectations. And you can do a comparable thing with process maps and so forth. But again, what you're defining first is what you expect people to produce, and then to the degree that's necessary, how to do it, what the behavior is. Measurement is also a big part of this, because when you can measure something, it gives you the opportunity to set goals. It also represents, for example, if I'm counting good widgets that come off the assembly line, or good decisions, or good proposals, whatever it is, if I've got criteria that I mentioned earlier that crisply defined what a good accomplishment or output is, that helps set expectations, and to know how many we're doing a month or a week or a day sort of is very clear, and then you can build feedback around that as well. So measurement is a big part of this. And when you can measure, it doesn't have to be big fancy measures, but just counting stuff, just paying attention to stuff in the way that measurement requires is an important part of expectations as well. I sort of threw this in because I did a blog recently, it's on our website, on so-called OKRs, which are a way to set goals that involves an objective for O and key results for KR. And this actually came out of work from decades ago in Silicon Valley, and it was sort of adopted and tweaked by Andy Grove, who the late CEO of Intel, and then John Doerr, who was a venture capitalist that worked with them, got really excited about it as a goal-setting framework, and he introduced it to Google. And when Google does stuff, everybody else copies. So OKRs have sort of come back from 50 years ago back into prominence these days. But if you go out on the web and you look at examples that people give you of OKRs, some of them are really fuzzy. They're sort of vague, futuristic objectives with descriptions of key results that are about activity. I still don't know when I'm done. So as I looked at that, I sort of got a little bit concerned about it, and I wrote a blog post that you can read if you want to on our website. But this is the way I would suggest people write goals, with business results and accomplishments. And in other words, in order to contribute to or achieve one or more business results, in order to improve revenue, I'm going to contribute some closed deals or some good relationships with prospective customers or whatever. In other words, you can set a really crisp goal if you say why, the business result you're trying to achieve or improve, and the output or accomplishments that you want to contribute. So that's just this is a part of setting expectations that can be formal or informal. The other thing that I mentioned before, but this graphic maybe makes it a little more obvious, is that box 1 is connected to every other cell in the model. Now, some of you have been through our programs where we show this picture, except it has links between every single box and every other box, which is true. These things are not separate things. But if you think about it, expectations must be aligned with consequences. I mean, if we don't recognize when people do what we ask them to do, they're probably not going to be doing it too much more. Feedback, expectations, with tools are also, because if I'm, for example, a tool might be a job aid or a piece of software. It might help to set expectations, actually. Or there might be a process in box 2 which defines what we expect people to do in that context. So those things are connected. Skills and knowledge and expectations are very important, because presumably if we're doing some sort of skill and knowledge development, we're focusing on enabling people to achieve the expectations that we set for them. That's what behavioral objectives are about, or outputs as objectives. If we're selecting and assigning people to jobs or hiring people, it's very helpful if those people know up front what the job's going to be, what the expectation is. And then when on the job, they have the opportunity to sort of follow those expectations. And the last one, motives and preferences, is quite interesting, because if all of the first five boxes are working well, one of the effects on people's attitude is positive. They're happy about that when it's all working together. And that actually feeds back to their expectation for when they walk into the job in the morning. So these things are all connected, and it's always worth thinking about them as they relate to one another. So those are some kind of insights and ideas that come out of the performance thinking framework. How do we apply those? What are some of the implications of that? So first of all, it goes back to my teacher, Dr. Skinner. He had he said something in response to one of his doctoral students many years ago, which has been quoted often by many people. The organism is always right. And if we say this in the work environment, people say, it's a little nerdy. But what it was about was one of his doctoral students was doing an experiment with some rats. And one of the rats was not behaving in the way the previous research papers and research had suggested. And so he came to Skinner and said, Dr. Skinner, this rat is not behaving right. And Skinner said, the organism is always right. And what he meant was that the conditions, that we respond to the conditions that exist. And how we respond is how we respond. And so, for example, when it comes to box one, an implication of that is an expectation is only functionally an expectation if it is. The notion of functional definition is a little bit nerdy, but a bunch of you I see come from a behavior science background. The notion of functional definition is to say that a consequence, we only can really call it a reinforcing consequence if it actually increases the frequency of the behavior it follows. And similarly, if we set an expectation, but the person or persons don't respond appropriately, then we didn't effectively set that expectation. We didn't actually do it. We needed to find out for sure what they heard and if they could do what we asked and so forth. So to me, this is a really important thing for us to remember, because another thing that maybe some of you have experienced, I've done projects in organizations where I've interviewed performers and I ask them various things, but among other things, I say, what about expectations for this part of your job? Are they really clear? And is it, and how do you get those? And they'll say, well, I don't know, man. The manager says a whole lot of stuff, and I'm always a little bit confused because it seems like some of the things aren't quite squaring up with each other. And you go talk to the manager, and the manager says, oh, no, I clearly set expectations. No problem. They should know what they're doing. Well, that manager needs to do some work. Because until your people can actually respond clearly and say, no, this is the most important thing, or these are the top three things, or this is what I want, what I'm expected to do, you haven't actually set expectations. Now, this follows along in that, and it's just George Bernard Shaw and his typical pithy statements. But the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So you may think you've set expectations, but you need to check. And this is really what it turns out to look like. In other words, you say, I'd like you to do this, da-da-da-da. So maybe at the end of the meeting, you say, can you tell me what it was we talked about here and what my expectation is? Or can you show me? One way or the other, you need to find out if the person or team or group or organization actually heard what you said in the way that you intended it, because otherwise, it's not going to work. Now, there's a whole lot of ways that expectations can either be great or not so great. And of course, ideally, you have crystal clear expectations. Everything's aligned. Everybody's all the way from the CEO down to the supervisor saying the same thing. We all know we heard it. No problem. However, sometimes there's a lot of unstated expectations. I have the habit, for example, of moving rather quickly. And I very often behave as though the people that work with me can read my mind. And it doesn't work that way. And you say, oh, they missed that. I guess I didn't even say it, did I? So unstated expectations don't work. Expectations that I or somebody can't accurately repeat back also mean you didn't do it. Somehow that needs to be clarified one way or the other. When expectations are unclear, they're not reliably actionable. So you might say that you set a goal and it needs to be actionable, or you set an expectation. But if the way you've set it does not enable people to reliably do it because it's unclear, again, it's not really an expectation. And then we've already mentioned, but conflicting expectations are one of the most common things, and I've got a few more examples of that. But not only up and down, from senior leaders down to frontline people, but also across silos. You often have marketing and sales and operations and finance and so forth actually having different expectations about certain goals or things that they're wanting to have happen. And then sometimes expectations change without anybody telling you that. That's another one. If you're a manager, supervisor, you've got to be on your toes. You got to say, wait a minute. Yeah, we had the strategy meeting yesterday, but I didn't tell the team, or whatever it is. And then, of course, sometimes there are obsolete expectations. This is one of the reasons that we interview current successful performers when we're trying to understand about their performance. Because if we talk to a manager who did the job a year ago, it may have changed. So those are all things that can sort of go wrong, or reasons they can go wrong. Now, here's another example that I think is quite interesting. Tom Gilbert sort of taught us about the idea of exemplary performer analysis. And what he said was, if you've got one or more superstars, whether they're individuals or teams, and they produce results more than pretty much anybody does. And I'm going to turn off my camera here because the sun is right in my face. But what I was going to say is if you look at exemplary performers, what Gilbert suggested was, if there's people who are super at something, way better than average, then we ought to go out and find out what they do. Because a lot of times they have unconscious competence, or they have little things they've discovered that make a difference. And very often those are small bits of behavior. But this was a cool example from a call center interview that I did probably 25 years ago, actually. And it was a woman, she was an Asian woman who was a customer service rep in a Southern California cell phone company. And she consistently, month after month, got higher customer satisfaction ratings than pretty much anybody in the call center. And she also had very high level of productivity. And so when I was interviewing her about a whole bunch of stuff, one of the things I said is, what's your expectation? Like, when do you know you're done with a call with a customer? And she said, I don't end the call until I can hear them smiling. Now, when she said that, it's like, oh, of course. Now, by the way, this woman, the reason I mentioned she was Asian is she spoke Mandarin Chinese as well as English. And so she worked with both English-speaking and Chinese-speaking customers. But in either language, she was listening for their tone of voice. And she wanted to be sure that by the end of the conversation, they were happy and she could actually hear the difference. And if you think about it, you can. But nobody in that call center else said that. And that was her own kind of expectation that she set for herself. It's like elite athletes who have extremely high expectations for themselves, and they do whatever it takes to reach them. So sometimes we can learn from exemplary performers expectations that, if shared with others, might help. Now, if you start thinking about all the ways that we communicate expectations, it's a lot more complicated than people think. People tend to think, well, if I just set expectations for my people, it'll be great. But, there's levels of expectations: organizational, business unit, department, team, individual. And those got to line up. And then there's things like strategic business plans, or department plans, or individual plans. Those ought to also line up. When you're developing a performance development plan for an individual, it's ideal if you can line that up with what we're trying to do for the business and why. And then, of course, there's the cocktail party effect. The boss, whoever the boss is, directly communicates to somebody. And then that person communicates to the next person, and that person connects, and it goes down the chain of bosses or up the chain. And sometimes a lot gets lost. So that's something where, if there's a really clear goal or expectation to set, especially a cultural value or something that's important strategically for the company, be sure that everybody's delivering the same message. And of course, walking the talk, how people behave, when you see what the boss does, when you see what the experienced people do, especially if you're a newbie, that sets expectations for how to behave around here. And if those people cut corners and don't follow the standard operating procedures or break the rules, then they will set models for other people. And everybody's seen that, I'm sure, in their work life. Cultural expectations. Don Toasty, one of my mentors, used to describe cultural practices as how we do things around here. And so how we treat customers, how we treat each other, what we do about diversity, inclusion, et cetera, those are cultural value statements, and those set expectations for people too. These days, an enormous amount of things in media, in social media, online, by devices, set expectations, implicitly maybe. Of course, calendars do, deadlines and those kind of things. What customers need and want and prefer ought to be setting expectations. For a customer service person or a salesperson, you're trying to address what they care about, what they need. And so to understand that is a way to discover the expectations for your own performance in relationship to them. And that applies also not just to individuals, but also, for example, in process work, people talk about voice of the customer. They really want to find out what the final product of this process ought to be in a way that meets the customer's needs so they can build the process to deliver on that way. Obviously, all kinds of documents set expectations. And then even I was thinking the other day, one of the things I was trained in writing, as well as in websites and so forth, is if you have an advanced organizer, like an agenda or a table of contents that's really crisp and clear, it sets expectations for where you find stuff and what you're going to be able to find in that document. Now, this is a thing that we did some years ago. We got involved with a colleague, Gordy Anderson, actually, who does lean process improvement in small, mostly manufacturing organizations. And we discovered this document that had dozens and dozens of tools and models and frameworks coming from lean process improvement, sort of the Toyota production system view. And you don't have to look at these in detail, but what you recognize here is that these guys who have refined lean process improvement over decades recognize all the different ways that expectations get set up. So vision and value statements. There's a lot of Japanese names in lean process improvement. Safety-focused environment, how the environment is created to support safety and what the signs say and what, et cetera. Principles, characteristics, all of these things set expectations, and there's more. Standard work, for example, is the way it's supposed to get done, and that's a phrase that's used in lean process improvement. Clear job descriptions. Some of our colleagues, some of you who are here, Shane Isley, Therese Longo, some of you guys work a lot on crisp, clear job descriptions based on accomplishments. These are all things, job aids. One of the things I love about job aids is if a good job aid, checklist, decision table, whatever, if it's well designed, it not only shows you what to do while you're doing the job, but it is setting expectations about what to do. So these are all things that set expectations. And again, sort of my recommendation to you is to think about box one as a very rich collection of things that as much as possible need to be lined up. Change management is another whole area or discipline where people pay attention to that. So just as in process improvement, sometimes there's project charter documents that sort of set the context and say why we're doing this and what we're going to do. And maybe there's presentations that go along with that or workshops. It is classic in change management, and I see Scott Mills here, who knows a lot about that, to have communication plans. In the ADKAR model for change management, there's two of the things in that acronym, awareness and knowledge, clearly incorporate things related to expectations. Most change management methodologies emphasize the importance of identifying champions and change agents, people who can effectively communicate what we're doing and why to their colleagues and to the people in the organization, and can actively engage in making it happen. They do a lot of expectation setting. And then, of course, if you're going to really do change management, we got to get everybody on the same page about it. So we need alignment. And the other thing, and this is really something that got added by our colleagues at Amgen some years ago when they talked about training and performance improvement as analysis, design, ADDIE, analysis, design, development, implementation, evaluation. They added sustainment to it. And what they meant by that was to be sure that you've thought through with the 6 boxes, including expectations, what it's going to take to sustain whatever the new thing is once the change happens. So change management has a lot of expectation stuff built into it. This comes really out of Roger Kaufman's analysis of mega, et cetera, levels, where from the individual to the department to the company and even societally, you'd like to clarify and align expectations across all those levels. And here's another one. Tim Eskew, a longtime colleague and friend, wrote this book many years ago, and it's really out of print now, and he's doing completely different work now. But it was very elegant, because what he said in that book was, in order to say that somebody's being managed, 3 conditions have to be in place. First of all, you have to have crystal clear expectations, and those were his words, so people know exactly what is expected. Secondly, they have to have frequent, continuous feedback, the performers themselves do. And thirdly, they need to be able to adjust resources and expectations if they're not achieving those expectations. Now, that's a very simple, elegant way to think about what management is. But again, it's a box 1 thing. It's really a technology or a methodology built around box 1. So these are just, I don't know if I'd say a short list, but you can read through these things. These are all places where sometimes you get misalignment. You get different supervisors, like in the call center example I mentioned, that set different expectations. You can get different business units that have different views about how you're supposed to do things. Or like I was working with a sales organization recently that had 2 separate sales. They had the major account folks and the other folks, and the leaders had very different expectations about how you're supposed to go about selling, and that caused some problems. You got a manager saying you should do it this way, and you look at the standard operating procedure document and say, wait a minute, that's not quite what it says. Who's right? Et cetera. Value statements that are on the wall, and then you look and you say, people aren't living this. Job description versus whatever the manager thinks is important. I mean, these are all examples. Day shift versus night shift in many companies. And so forth. So these are worth thinking about when you look at your own organization and your own teams, saying, have we got all these things straightened out? Where do we have risk of messing up expectations? Here's one from the applied behavior analysis autism world. I was working in a larger autism services company some years ago, and there was a huge turnover, as there are in many companies, but in frontline registered behavior techs. And they were trying to do some sort of culture thing from the top down and sort of, have things stated and create, benefits and all these things to keep people around. But I suggested to somebody who I was coaching through a certification project to go talk to some of these people and talk to them about the 6 boxes. And she found a whole lot of conflicting things in there, tools that didn't work, et cetera. But one of the clear examples was, it was stated as very important to develop a relationship with the parents, a good working relationship with the parents and the therapist. However, that time was not billable. And so this was this conflict, big push for billable hours in terms of the consequences and in terms of the, how people were managed. And yet you were supposed to build a relationship with the parents. So guess what? The relationships didn't always work out that way, except unless people came out with really clear ideas, clever ways to do work with the kid while the parent was there, for example. And it also created a lot of angst among these frontline people. So that's another example of a conflict. In our programs, we often brainstorm examples of things in the different cells. This is what one group came up with. This is a random list of, these are all things that affect what people expect. Here's another group. What you say in emails, what you say in your coaching sessions, what the employee handbook says. Those are all sources of expectations. And here's yet another group, project schedules, etc. I published an article a few years ago on establishing cultural values and practices. And what it suggested, bottom line, is that if managers or direct supervisors work with their people to define their jobs in terms of accomplishments, or outputs, they can then look at those outputs and see which of the organization's value statements apply, how they apply, and what you need to do to apply them for that job, for that person in that context. And so the idea here was a little different than most people apply cultural development. It was like, let's bring this down to the ground level where managers and supervisors are helping their people understand how to practice these values in their jobs. This is one of those things which I actually learned from a colleague years ago when he was trying to understand why we thought accomplishments or work outputs were important. And I just said, have you ever been in a meeting that failed to produce any valuable work outputs? And of course, everybody has. You usually get a laugh with this one, but it makes its point. Because when you get to the end of a meeting and it's just talk for an hour, but you didn't produce any decisions, agreements, next steps, whatever, you got a problem. So one of the suggestions is that have a meeting agenda. And even if you don't have an agenda, start the meeting by saying, what do we want to get out of this meeting? When we get to the end, what are the things we want to be sure we've accomplished? That's a simple example, and it can make meetings much more productive. All that time that people spend can make them more productive. So basically, this is a silly slide, but getting box one makes a lot of things easier and better. And here's some takeaways. First of all, expectations are all over the place, the things that set expectations. So be sensitive to that. Pay attention, especially if you're a leader, manager, business owner, or whatever. Pay attention to all the things that set expectations, not just the formal stuff that maybe the training facilitator said, but the informal stuff about what past participants say, etc. And start with expectations. Try to be clear up front if you can. And I fail at this as much as anybody, but I've learned from bad experience that if you don't, even if you try, sometimes it doesn't work. But if you start with expectations, it makes a difference. Ultimately, if you let this slide, you get both less productive people and less engaged people. If you're in an environment where who knows what the heck you're supposed to do, you're probably going to try to get out of it pretty soon if you can, unless they pay you an awful lot. And leaders and managers fundamentally are the ones responsible here for arranging this. At a leadership level, at an organizational level, you can control the systems and the communications if you do your job well. At the individual supervisor and manager level, you're really setting the expectations for the people sitting in front of you or working in front of you. Again, this goes back to the expectations everywhere. Take them all into account. Not just what people say, but what the environment suggests. You say, well, we want people to be very, we want people to sort of clean up after their session. And then you go down the hall and you see the boss's office is a mess. You say, oh, I don't know, how are we supposed to really do this around here? And then I would say, I kind of came up with this the other day, but repeat expectations, not like a machine, but be sure you set expectations and be sure you refine them if it doesn't seem like people are hearing you, and be sure to revise them, and then when needed, and then check, see if people heard it. So that's basically what I have to say. A couple of last minute things. A bunch of you know this, but we've made our coaching program completely virtual, and COVID really got in the way, and so we haven't piloted it yet. So we're going to, in the next couple months, and we haven't figured out when yet, but we're going to pilot this program. And we've got some people who want to be certified deliberate, some of whom are in this group. But just want to let you know, if you're interested, not necessarily in becoming certified deliberate, but just going through the program, we're going to have a bargain price, let's put it that way, because it really is going to be a pilot. So if you're interested, email me. And then our next open performance thinking practitioner program, our performance consulting certification program, the next one that's happening is September 11th, but that's kind of too late now, except if you want to really jump in fast. We got a few open seats, but the next scheduled one is in the beginning of January. So start thinking about that if you've got colleagues who might be interested. We also have our free study guides, and although we haven't put any new ones out for a couple months because we were distracted by our big move, which is sort of still in progress. But if you want to subscribe, you can point your phone at that QR code and just get your name on the list. And that way, every time we come up with a new one, we'll send you that information. So I know we're at the end of the time, almost exactly, but I wonder if in the chat box people have any comments, questions, or for that matter, if you want to raise your hand and speak, I think we could do that. What do you think? Anyone? You haven't left me, so at least you may be fixing lunch while you listen, but comments, questions, additional points you'd like to make? No. Well, okay. Well, thanks, Amy. So I know everybody's got to go to a meeting, so I appreciate that. And I can tell from Aloha, I hope you're not on Maui. Obviously, you're probably not. But all right. Thank you, everyone. I think we're done for the day. And this will get posted on YouTube in a few days. And you'll get a message when it is. So thank you very much.